Today we're going to learn about infinitives. We're going to learn how to form them and how to translate them. You've already been introduced to infinitives in the context of the principal parts of any verb, but you may not have really thought about what an infinitive is or what it does. The word infinite means something that is not complete or doesn't have an end. And so the infinitive of any verb is its incomplete, that is, its unconjugated form. You already know one infinitive, and that is the second principal part. So in a verb like amo, amare, amavi, amatum, amare is the present infinitive. It is present and it is active. To love, right, is how we often translate it. But Latin actually has 6 different infinitive forms, and we're going to need to know these forms in order to do the next piece of work that we're going to do. So knowing how to form these infinitives and how to translate them is going to become important. The 6 infinitives that Latin has are present active, perfect active, and future active, and present passive, perfect passive, and future passive. And each of these infinitives has a slightly different translation because it's going to reflect whether or not it's present or perfect, whether it's active or passive, right? So our translation is going to change, but one thing that's consistent is that we always start off with to. So that will be the thing that you can sort of take to the bank. Okay, well, let's take a look. Here they are in all their glory, right? So if we look at our active infinitives, you can see that we have to love in the present, to have loved in the perfect, and in the future, to be about to love, just as we've been translating our participles. In the passive, you can see that these get passive translations. Instead of to love, to be loved. Instead of to have loved, to have been loved. And instead of to be about to love, to be about to be loved. As you can imagine, the most common infinitives are the present and perfect, both active and passive. The future infinitives, not terribly common, and in fact this one is so rare that you virtually never see it. It's important to know it, but it's not something that you'll commonly see, and so you shouldn't worry overly much about it, especially if you see it in a sentence and you've forgotten completely what it is. That would be totally normal. Okay? You can see that these forms, if we look at the forms of the infinitive, they look pretty similar. You can see amare and amari, right, are not so different. They differ by one letter. You can see that amawise, that amawi, right, this is our third principal part. And you can see that this is our fourth principal part, and really it looks a lot like the perfect passive of the verb. It's just that we have esse here instead of a conjugated verb, a conjugated form of the verb to be. And you can see that the future infinitive is that future participle plus a form of the verb to be. So in some ways, these are kind of logical creations from the participles and the principal parts that we already know. But let's look at it a little more closely. So here's how we form present infinitives, which is really easy. The present active infinitive, the one that would mean, right, amare, is just our second principal part, always. And we would translate this to love. Our present passive infinitive, in general, what we do is remove the E at the end, right, this E, and we add an I instead. We do this for the first, for the second, and for the fourth conjugations. You can see amare becomes amari, Videre becomes videri. Audiri becomes audiri. Okay? The one that's different, of course, is the third. And here we remove that whole ERE ending, and you just get diki. Okay? And this would mean to be loved, right? To be seen, to be spoken, to be heard. Okay, but that's all you have to do. For the most part, we change the E to an I, except in the third, right, which is always the tricky one, where we're going to remove that whole ERE and then add our I. Okay, so that's really pretty straightforward, pretty easy. Perfect infinitives are also pretty easy to form. For the perfect active, we're going to take the third principal part, whatever it is, and we're going to add SSE to the end. And that's it. That's all we have to do. So amawi becomes amawisse. Kepi, right, which is a third IO, becomes kepisse. Wolui, which is an irregular verb, becomes woluisse. If your verb has a third principal part, then all you do is add SSE and you are home free. That is how we do it. And for example, this is, if you remember learning a verb like koipi, which we just had, which means began, the infinitive is koipisse, right? Even though, since that is the form it has, right? Or for odi, it's odisse, even for these defective verbs. So amawisse means to have loved. Kepisse, to have captured, right? Woluisse, to have wanted. So they are easy to form and really consistent. And of course, the translations are consistent too. To have whatever. The perfect passive infinitive is also pretty easy. As I just said in the previous two slides previously, it looks a lot like the perfect passive of a verb, except instead of conjugating our form of esse, we just have our form of esse right there. So our perfect passive infinitive is amatus or amata or amatum esse, right? And for these other verbs, right, captus esse, auditus esse, right? If it has a fourth principal part, then we can make it into a perfect passive participle, or a perfect passive infinitive. And this would be to have been loved, right? As opposed to have loved, to have been captured, to have been heard. So it's really pretty straightforward. Easy, easy, easy. Okay. You'll notice though that we do use masculine, feminine, and neuter because you'll find out in situations where we use these infinitives, we sometimes need them to agree with something in case, number, and gender because they really are participles, they're adjectives. And so we want to make sure we remember that part of it. Okay. Finally, our future infinitives. Just as with the previous, with the perfect passive infinitives, future active infinitives work the same way. We're going to use our future active participle plus esse. So instead of amatus, amata, amatum esse, we have amaturus, amatura, amaturum esse, or capturus esse, or auditurus esse. So it works in the exact same way, only with the future participle instead of the perfect. And we'll translate it in the same way. To be about to love. Or to be about to capture, to be about to hear. The future passive infinitive is super rare. I have seen it only a handful of times in my life in the course of reading Latin. It just does not occur very often. But if we need to use it, we use the supine. So remember, that's going to look like the perfect passive participle, but it will only be neuter, accusative, and we use iri, which is the present passive infinitive of ao, to go. Okay, so don't even try to translate this literally. It will be completely weird, right? So instead, for this, we would have amatum iri, right? This is our supine in the accusative. Or we would have something like captum iri, again, the supine in the accusative. And this would be to be about, to be loved. Okay, you can see already it's going to be rare that this would be something that one would want to say. But it's there if we need it. Okay? So just infinitives are an incomplete form of the verb. They're not conjugated, and so we always translate them with the word to. Latin has 6 different infinitives, and we're going to learn how to use them soon, but right now we're just going to focus on learning them. You need to know your principal parts in order to form the infinitives correctly. So we use the present infinitive, the second principal part, and in some sense the first, because we need to know what conjugation a verb belongs to in order to do the present passive infinitive. We need the third principal part and the fourth in order to do our perfect and our future infinitives. And that's it. And of course, we need to know how to translate these infinitives correctly. So for your homework, I would like you to form all 6 infinitives and translate them for these 8 verbs. Remember that maybe not all of these verbs are going to have all 6 infinitives. That's possible. That irregular verbs, of course, aren't always going to, you want to make sure you focus on the principal part that you're using, not on following some kind of pattern. And you will notice that I've given you here a couple of deponent verbs, and I want you to just think about how that might work and see if you can figure out the correct answer. Of course, deponent verbs are passive in form, active in meaning, so they're not going to have all of those infinitives, right? So think about what that's going to do and what that's going to look like. Okay? Super.